Now on the stage here in the Agriland Pavilion at the National Ploughing Championships, we have a panel focused on the tillage sector for you, and of course the tillage sector very closely linked with, of course, the National Ploughing Championships as well. Joining me here on stage is Kieran McEvoy, the IFA National Tillage Committee Chair. We also have Shay, Phelan, who is the tillage specialist with Teagasc, and Richard Halloren, Agriland journalist, who of course will be very familiar to our Agriland readers as well, producing great content and great opinion pieces on a weekly basis to spark some debate, no doubt, around the country. But I'm going to start with yourself, Shay, firstly. I suppose from Teagasc data, how bad a year has 2023 been for the tillage sector? We've seen photos of crops really suffering out there. It's been very difficult weather-wise. We've high costs against the back of it, and it has been a tough year. 2022 is a distant memory, unfortunately.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's been probably one of the toughest years that I can remember. Normally we would do a harvest report every year, and normally we would see that total production of cereals will be somewhere in the region of about 2.2, 2.3, even 2.4 million tonnes. We're guessing this year, not guessing, we're kind of estimating this year that's going to be somewhere south of 2 million tonnes, so it's probably going to be maybe 1.9 million tonnes, somewhere in that sort of ballpark. So if you think of that, that's nearly 500,000 tonnes of grain less in the country. And that's only part of the story. I mean, the other part of the story has been the costs, as you say, in terms of growing those crops, which have been significantly higher this year and last year than they would have been. But last year we were compensated by high prices and good yields. So I suppose in terms of where crops are and tillage farmers are at the moment, it certainly is one of the most difficult years that we've ever had. And throwing the weather on top of that, come harvest time and so on and so forth, the costs around that. So I think this year is definitely going to leave tillage farmers in a tough place in a lot of cases. A lot of crops are not going to wash their face, unfortunately, and they're going to be left with bills rather than what they're going to make from some crops. And I think that's the reality of it. And it can be kind of scary on a lot of farms that some farms suffered worse than others. So it's a very individual situation this year on a lot of farms. But nonetheless, I think the whole industry as a whole has suffered a lot this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And is that across all crops, do you feel, Shay? Is there particular standout crops that have suffered more than others? Or is it, as you say, dependent on the location of the farm?
Yeah, it really is dependent on location. Now, some crops, certainly in this area, we would have been able to sow, say, malt and barley in February and early March. And some of those crops, thankfully, did quite well, passed for malting, so they were quite good. But then you have other guys and other farms where they didn't get into sowing barley until May even. And some of those crops are awful, to be perfectly honest with you. Maybe at less than 2 tonnes to the hectare or 2 tonnes to the acre. So again, they're very, very poor. And when you take in the price that they're getting for the grain and the straw, lack of straw as well. So the overall income on those fields has been quite poor. I suppose if I look at anything that was probably doing well, some bean crops are doing quite well, and I suppose the support that's there in terms of the protein payment is going to help those growers, as is the straw incorporation scheme, which is a huge success this year. A lot of people took the advantage of using that straw chopping scheme, and that will certainly help incomes. But the crops themselves have been very, very poor.
And before I bring Kieran in, in terms of harvest 2023, are we complete now? Almost complete? Is it a long way off for some?
Myself and Kieran were just talking about this earlier on. I was in Wexford last weekend. There's still spring barley to be cut down there. Spring beans still have to be cut. And again in the northeast and the northwest, still barley and protein crops to be cut as well. So probably somewhere in the region about 5, maybe 6%, but that varies from region to region or from area to area. But there's still that amount out there. You know?
And as the year goes on, then you wonder about quality as well. What's going to be brought in?
There's still quite a lot of straw on the ground as well, which hasn't been gathered up as well. I know that's driving into the feeding into the straw market as well, where straw is now very, very scarce on a lot of farms, and a lot of tillage farmers are getting phone calls looking for straw and they simply don't have it.
Look, Kieran, I want to bring you in here because I think Shay has really laid bare the challenges that are facing the tillage sector. And, the draft interim report of the Food Vision Tillage Group, we got sight of it here in Agriland. You're part of that group. It's chaired by Matt Dempsey. I mean, that group has been asked to produce a report to sustainably grow the sector by 400,000 hectares by the end of this decade. There's 20 recommendations in that report at the moment. do they provide the answers for the tillage sector? Because 400,000 hectares by the end of this decade is a huge ask.
Well, look, I suppose, Aisling, I suppose I'll start by saying that a lot of farm organisations and the whole industry were involved in that Food Vision 2030 group. And look, I see that as a pathway long-term for the tillage industry and to get the tillage industry to grow. But I mean, in the short term, it's going to be an uphill battle to retain the acreage we have. It's going to be an uphill battle to try and get the farmers that stay here, myself included, to survive this year. And I mean, the reality is, tillage farmers are in trouble, and this is a major problem this year. There's no hiding that. So look, of the 20 measures that's there at the moment, there's none of them a silver bullet for this harvest. That's been honest. It's a a plan for the future, and to get the acreage up. But I think the biggest problem is what acreage are we going to lose, and what farmers we're going to lose out of Harvest 23.
So is Budget 2024, could that provide a silver bullet for tillage farmers?
We would hope so.
Are you asking Charlie McConlogue to get on to his colleague Michael McGrath and find some money for this sector?
Yes, we would be. We would be seeking a meeting with the Minister. We had a National Grain Committee meeting in IFA last Friday, and we got a fairly up-to-date picture of the whole country. And I mean, the first time I've ever gone to a meeting in September that there's not some part of the country fully finished harvest. Maybe northeast or even a little bit north of here, into Offaly and places, there'd be bits and pieces, but practically every county had something left to harvest. And I mean, that's the last bit that's in the field, is the last bit to maybe pay a bill or pay for a machine. So there is a real problem there, yeah.
Richard, I'm going to bring you in here because, looking at that figure of growing the tillage area by 400,000 hectares by the end of this decade, we're now coming off the back of the news about the nitrates derogation being cut. The pressure on the land market already, we see the prices that are being paid for land, and rental land as well is astronomical, and the pressure from the dairy sector is only going to continue. Where do you see this going?
Well, I think the reality for me is that you don't need to be Albert Einstein to work out that tillage is facing into a perfect storm, both in the short term and in the longer term. And in truth, all roads, as far as I can see, in terms of bringing some hope to the picture, to the situation, lead to the door of the Farm Minister. There will be significant pressure brought on the Minister to come up with some form of compensation scheme to get farmers over the hump. That is 2022, 2023. The guys have outlined in some, the
he does
issues
have
that are out there.
$7.5 million from the EU Commission. We're still waiting to hear how the department, but $7.5 million won't go far if it's split how many ways,
No, but I think the bigger picture is how do tillage farmers themselves perceive themselves as being? And there is more than a feeling out there that they're second-class citizens within Irish agriculture. And I think that's a fundamental reality that the tillage vision
to the
group,
dairy sector?
Well, if you go back into the history of the dairy sector, when quotas were brought to an end, they were given every encouragement to push forward, to grow their businesses, to bring in new entrants. We have never seen that for tillage, certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what's the saying, by land, they're not making any more of it, so there's only a finite amount of land out there as well.
Truly,
Look, I mean, Kieran, coming back to that Food Vision tillage report as well, and I know it's only an interim report that we're looking at, taxation measures, and the budget is just around the corner. How could taxation measures help out the tillage sector, do you feel?
Well, look, the way that the Food Vision group worked was we tried to include any possibilities, and look, there's going to be a focus group on taxation to see is there any tax incentives that we can bring to bear to help tillage farmers, both on the land rental and maybe on other issues. So maybe on investment, I don't know. So it's a very open book on the taxation.
Yeah, absolutely. And an interesting recommendation as well, Shay, and it kind of comes back to the dairy sector as well, and I suppose to the livestock sector. The Food Vision group looking as well at exporting slurry, and I suppose more cooperation between the sectors. And as Richard said there, maybe some tillage farmers feel a little bit forgotten in the push for maybe dairy expansion. And do you think we need to see greater cooperation between the sectors?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt, actually, we do need to see more cooperation because, again, I suppose the nitrates issue is starting to put even more pressure on land. The drop from 250 to 220. And again, listen to farmers and dairy farmers as well. They're feeling this price crunch as well. So going out and paying more money for even more scarce land because they're all being tied up in long-term leases is not the answer. So I think in that scenario, then really there has to be more cooperation with tillage farmers. And we are starting to see arrangements where it might be straw for slurry, or I think those sort of arrangements out there, and they're not uncommon. They're not terribly popular, but they're not uncommon. So I think there's definitely scope there for some sort of facilitation or agreement or scheme whereby tillage farmers can help to mitigate against some of the problems that the dairy sector is going to have, and vice versa. I mean, why do we all have to be fighting for the same land when we can actually use it in conjunction with one another? And I think that sort of cooperation is the way we're going to find a way out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, there is one direction of travel from the EU as well when it comes to pesticides, and there's work to be done there as well on, pest management and everything like that. And research is needed in that area as well, because that is coming down the track, and it's coming down the track fast as well.
Yeah, and I suppose what's interesting about that is we had at our crops forum just a number of weeks ago, we had a representative from the EU Commission over telling and basically laying out where the roadmap for the future is. Yeah. And so one of the good points about that was he was able to point out that we're probably ahead of the curve in terms of meeting the targets in terms of pesticide reduction between now and 2030. And I'm currently involved in a project called IPM Works, which is an EU-wide project looking at integrated pest management techniques and how they can be adopted on farm to reduce our dependence on a lot of these pesticides. And I suppose that's something where we kind of need to go and get farmers to talk to farmers about how they're actually doing it, as much as us researchers or research organisations are doing it as well.
Yeah, I suppose that's where the likes of the IFA comes in, Kieran, as well.
Yeah, look, we'd be very concerned about the regulations. We also feel that, and we represent grain farmers at European level as well through another farm organisation, and we would have lots of discussion around it. We're probably, we have a good bit of the work is done, and a lot of the chemicals that are on the list are gone already, but we feel there can be no more tools taken out of our toolbox until there's a replacement. And I think that's a very important aspect, that there should be a substitute for the chemical if it has to be removed. And also, the likes of gene editing and those technologies, they have to come forward now. And I think if you look at the European level, there's a little bit more realisation, plant breeding and gene editing maybe together, that we might need be as reliant on these chemicals.
That's going to be needed to make all of this work. I mean, the national finances are in maybe the strongest state they've ever been. So there is a degree of expectation that it is time for government to put the proverbial money where their mouth is. Mm-hmm. And the other, I suppose the elephant in the room for me is the banks. What are they going to do in the context of all this? Yeah. I think they're critically important, both in the short term and longer term. How are they going to see the future for tillage farming?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just I'd like to come in on that. I think the one thing that we've seen with the Minister and with the tillage incentive scheme, and even with the protein scheme, which we welcome very much, the protein scheme and the straw chopping, it's going to take finances to get people to sustain the area they have and to grow the area. And I think that's a very important point. And just on the banks issue, Richard, I have called in our organisation, and they have accepted that we need to go and meet all the major pillar banks to try and put some kind of pressure on them to be. Now, I know, speaking to some of the banks, they are well willing to work with us and with farmers, but at the same time, there's going to be hard decisions.
And what
to be
does that look like? Extending kind of more favourable finance on better terms, or what are you looking for from the banks?
We would hope that to do something on terms,
Yeah.
Take some of the pressure off, and maybe some kind of a scheme package.
Yeah. And Shay, I suppose, speaking about finances, fertiliser price was very expensive for a lot of tillage farmers. It has come down in recent months, and it's to the benefit of maybe other sectors that they needed it later in the year. But, a lot of the tillage farmers out there suffered. What are we seeing going forward? Is there any kind of, I'm getting you to be Mystic Meg now a little bit.
The good news is, I suppose, from that point of view, we're just doing a provisional cost and returns budget, which we do every year around this time. And definitely the costs have come down, there's no doubt about that. Fertiliser being the main one. I mean, this time last year you would have been looking at the likes of, say, can being somewhere in around €800-900 a tonne. This year it's a lot less. That's about 350 or 380 or something like that. So in that regard, it has come back. Likewise, seed costs have come back down as well. I suppose fuel is the one we're kind of worried about at the moment. Like fuel costs are continuing to rise, as are like machinery costs.
Yeah.
So they're the ones we kind of have to track and keep an eye on. And there's only a limited amount of things that we can actually do about those. But I think overall, I suppose, if I have to try and project into 2024 in terms of where costs are going to be in 2024, I don't see them being as high as 2023. But they could be lower. They're not going to be as low as they probably need to be in order for guys to make a decent
And what
margin.
are the futures saying in terms of prices? Is there any light in the horizon?
That's real domestic MIG stuff now.
I know, yeah. We'll have you doing a horoscope next.
To be fair, if you're looking at the markets over the last number of weeks and months, they've been kind of going up and down within a band, kind of the mid to low, or the low to mid 200s for wheat and barley, and everything else is balanced off of that. So
is the Ukraine situation, is the Black Sea Grain Initiative having a trickle-down effect?
Every now and again
that?
it does, and you'll see maybe something happens in the Ukraine and there's a spike for a couple of days and then it settles back down to where it had been previous to that. I think that situation has kind of been factored out of the market a lot at this stage. I mean, global supply chains have pretty much settled down after all the hassle that was out there in the Ukraine, and people have forward contracts there. It's the uncertainty that creates the rise and fall in prices. So where there's uncertainty, you get these spikes in prices, not necessarily supply chains. It's how the traders look and how those supply chains are going to be affected, and they set the price then. So I suppose if you're looking at wheat at the moment, you're probably talking maybe 220, 225 a tonne, barley probably a tenner underneath that, and that's where they've kind of stayed in the last 4, 5, 6 months, you know. So I can't see that changing unless there's something incredibly happens that's affected with climate change or something, or climate that's a drought in southern hemisphere countries or something like that affects total supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I suppose, they haven't gotten it all wrong in the Department of Agriculture, to be fair to them. Kieran, we have mentioned the strong corporation measure a few times. That has been very successful. Like, what would you like to see happen with that into the future? Expansion and kick it on? I mean, there seems to be an appetite there for it.
I think there's a huge appetite for the strong corporation measure, and it has been very successful. And I think we have looked for the area to be increased to 55,000. It's set at 40,000 for the next 5 years in the plan. We've looked for it to be increased to 55,000, and I think that's a target that the government have set, along with getting the grain area up to 400,000 hectares. So I think it's not an unreasonable ask. And I mean, the likes of the protein payment have been, you can see beans in every county. So I mean, it just comes back to, that we have a reasonably good working relationship with the department, but that's not going to cover the cracks that's there this year. And I mean, there's going to have to be some kind of a rescue package from the department for tillage farmers.
Yeah, and where's the future going here as well? I mean, when we look at generational renewal and that whole aspect, we need young farmers coming into tillage. And, I don't want to be negative, but the picture that we've painted, and I know 2023 is probably an exceptionally bad year, but there are issues there that have been going on for multiple years now. And Shay, I suppose from a Teagasc point of view, in bringing younger people into this sector, I mean, obviously the costs of setting up are quite prohibitive, as well.
Yeah, you're right. And access to land is probably the other one.
Yeah.
And I do know that, young trained farmers are hungry for land. They're going through our colleges and, they are being well educated, so they're not fools. They know what the markets are. They know how the prices structures work. So they're well educated, if you like. So they're not going to jump into something that they know is not going to make money. Yeah. And I think that's where the crux of the matter is. If they can see a business, whether it be a tillage business or a dairy business or a dry stock business, where they can see a future and an income for themselves and their families, they will take up the mantle. And I think that's the challenge, is to make sure that there is a sustainable income for those young trained farmers as they come out of colleges. Yeah. And I think if that's there, you will see them there.
And I know, Richard, you were very passionate about bringing younger people into the journalism sector, more than you are into the tillage sector.
Yeah, I mean, young people are our future. But I think, it's not all gloom and doom, if I could say that. I mean, there are examples, very significant examples of what has worked well within tillage, the crop sector. Malting barley is a case in point. We're adding value. That sector is underpinning some of the most prestigious drinks brands in the world. And when you contrast that scenario with, let's say, feed grains, there's no traceability system that I'm aware of within Irish agriculture to tell you where feed barley, feed wheat, how it moves along the chain. If we had that, it would allow then other sectors, the feed compounding sector, the milk processing sector, the beef processing sector, to actually have firm evidence to allow them then to promote this is Irish milk, Irish beef, Irish pork from farm to fork. And that surely has got to be an aspiration that should be made a reality as we move to the future. But we don't have the traceability system at that basic farm level at the moment truly in place to make any of that happen. So,
okay. And final word, you wanted to come back in there, Kieran, did you?
It was just when you were talking about bringing young farmers in. Look at, there's plenty of young farmers. You know, there's not a lot, but there's farmers there that would. But I mean, we're in 2 years now of just volatility. I'm farming since 1990. And I mean, if you were wrong by 20 euros on grain and 15 on fertiliser, you consider yourself after doing a bad job. And like for the last 2 years, you could be out by 150 euros and 500 euros. So I suppose that's what we're saying is now is the time that, you know, the minister needs to take care of tillage farmers to get them through these volatile times. It's not something we've created. And I mean, grain is flowing from the Ukraine through Europe, which is not helping the grain markets either. So, and it's keeping the market from rising. So, I mean, we could end up with, we don't know where fertiliser is next March. We can get a price today, but we don't know where it is next March. Yeah. So it's that volatility that we need to get covered for at the moment. Yeah. I think that's what's really taking lumps out of us this year, you know.
Okay, well, we'll see what the Minister can get from his colleague Michael McGrath in the Department of Finance. Thank you so much, Kieran McEvoy from the IFA, Shay Phelan from Teagasc, and our very own Richard Halloren as well. Now we're heading back out onto site to see what the Agriland team have been getting up to here at the National Ploughing Championships.